I have literally avoided this subject since the beginning of my channel, because it's extremely politically charged, but I feel like it's time I addressed it. Is feminism a cult? And more broadly, is social justice a cult? What about anti-SJW culture? Has it ever exhibited cult-like behavior? We'll take a look. Before we do though, I want you guys to give serious thought to what I have to say. If you find yourself offended by something I'm saying, then step back and ask yourself why. I don't hate anybody for anything, and you guys know that. I'm trying to come at it in as reasonable a way as I possibly can, but I'm probably committing career suicide by bringing it up in the first place. Okay, with that being said, let's get into it. I started YouTube March 11th, 2016, because everybody was talking about SJWs. I didn't want to get into it. I was on my way out of religion. I wanted to hear about Kent Hovind and God's Not Dead 2 and all of that. But there was almost nobody talking about that stuff. I mean, I was listening to how toxic feminism was and how harmful SJWs are and all that, and I agreed with it. But I was really looking for stuff about religion. It came to the point where I decided to go through Logic's series on Kent Hovind, and then I decided to watch Kent Hovind's entire video series, start to finish, looking for cohesiveness between ideas, looking for inconsistencies. For those of you who don't know how long that stuff is, it took me literally days to get through it. At that point, I decided to start my own channel. I saw a gap in the market and I filled it. Too many people talking about SJWs, not enough people talking about religion. And from that moment on, I swore I would never address this subject, although eventually I did make one video on it long ago. But there are people out there like me who wanted to hear about religion. People who were trying to exit cults and didn't know where to turn or what to do. As long as those people are out there, I will always focus on cults, primarily religious cults. But I'm gonna stray away for just a second and talk about this mess we call SJW and anti-SJW culture. So what happened with the whole SJW thing? I met somebody recently who'd been sufficiently disconnected from that world enough that they had never heard the term social justice warrior or SJW. What is it? Is it a cult? First of all, there is a difference between advocating for social justice and being a social justice warrior. Just like there's a difference between being against the anti-SJW ideology and being anti-SJW. When I refer to social justice, I'm talking about justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within society. That's the dictionary definition. Now, that philosophy might not be exactly what we need, or it might be, I don't know. But when I talk about social justice warriors, I'm completely excluding that philosophy from the conversation. Anti-SJWs commonly talk about classical liberalism and how we should maximize freedom. I have my own ideas on that stuff, but I'm not getting into that here. The political philosophies that come with the groups are irrelevant. When I refer to SJWs or anti-SJWs, I'm talking about the extremist groups that exhibit toxic behavior. Okay, let's take a quick look at both sides of the argument and see if we can find inconsistencies and questionable behavior. We'll start with SJWs. What types of stuff does this group say or do that could be considered cult-like or harmful? The problem is that both groups are very amorphous. There's no strict hierarchical structure to speak of, which actually makes this a little bit easier because instead of talking about people specifically, we can focus in on bad behavior and ideas. But that means it isn't a cult. It's an extremist ideology at best, or a cult-like mindset. Now, don't get me wrong. There are certainly pockets of people who get radicalized by others. Those could be considered cults in some cases. But without a hierarchical structure to define a set of rules and set up a system of rewards and punishments for people who break these rules, as far as I'm concerned, it's not a cult. Here's some examples of ways in which SJWs exhibit cult-like behavior. Remember, when I say SJW, I'm talking about the extremist ideals and behavior. Some of these might be fake, but remember that there are legitimately people who feel this way. This one says mental anxiety, mental breakdown, menstrual cramps, menopause. Did you ever notice how all of your problems begin with men? What's wrong with this? The biggest issue I see here is the fact that it's separating people into in-groups and out-groups and blaming the entire out-group for problems they have. Obviously, this is satirical, but like I said, there are people who feel this way. It needs to be addressed. This next one says, hey, just so you know, if you're cis, you don't get to make gender jokes. The end. This is not only applicable to straights. If you're cis, you have cis privilege, and you do not have the right to make those jokes. They're not yours, it's not your place, stop. One big issue with this is something called the fallacy of change. This is a common thing in psychology, specifically in cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a cognitive distortion. The fallacy of change is when somebody expects other people to change to make them happy. Your happiness is your responsibility, nobody else's. The onus is on you to remove yourself from a situation that makes you unhappy. If somebody tells a joke that you don't like, it's your responsibility to leave, not try to get them removed from the venue. Now, if other people feel the same way about the joke, then they can leave too. And event organizers are free to decide if they want a controversial figure who's going to make really edgy jokes or not. It's risky. They might lose their audience if they say something too stupid. But putting pressure on people to deplatform somebody is committing the fallacy of change. I wouldn't invite the Church of Scientology onto my channel to talk for an hour unrebutted. And I shouldn't be forced to do that if I don't want to. But if I choose to do that, it would be my choice. I'd lose some of my audience as a result. But the moment my audience tried to force me not to do that, or the moment they tried to force me to talk about a specific subject by threatening or blackmailing me or something, that's where it crosses the line. Feel free to voice your opinion. Don't impose your will on me. Feel free to voice your opinion to a university about platforming Milo Yiannopoulos. Don't try to impose your will on them. Don't try to force them to deplatform him with threat of consequences outside of your absence at that conference if they don't comply. Here's another problem I see. I understand people want to see higher representation of certain demographics in various things. I understand people want to eliminate bias, which most definitely does exist. Women have biases for other women, men have biases for other men, Asians have biases for other Asians. That's how it works. Our brains identify the most with people who look like us or act like us. But that's not good. We should strive to eliminate that. It's in-group, out-group thinking. It leads to overgeneralization and prejudice. Problem is that there's no good way to eliminate that from our brains completely. It's hardwired into us through millions of years of evolution. So what do we do about it? Here's something we can do. We try to counter the bias by considering all other factors and balancing things back out. That's what affirmative action strives to do in the US. Here's an example. If you have a conference and you want to invite some YouTubers to speak, first and foremost, your goal should be to get people who know the subject material. You should have people who know what they're talking about, who are good at what they do, and who are perfectly qualified for the position you're trying to fill, period. Now, if every single candidate you have is equally as qualified and equally as popular, and the only difference between them is their gender or their race or something, which should you pick? This is an unrealistic scenario because there's so much variation. So I'm not speaking literally, it's more philosophical. Should you do 50-50? 50-50 seems intuitive. Like we want an equal distribution of female speakers and male speakers, because that's a distribution in society, about 50% males, 50% females. But I'm not looking for distribution in society as a whole. I'm looking for distribution in the field. So how many female YouTubers are there who are in the atheist community and also over, say, 100,000 subscribers, versus how many males? That's probably the number we should be striving for. There are lots and lots of factors involved in who gets selected and why. If 6% of the people who speak at conferences are female, that isn't entirely because of bias. It isn't anywhere near that simple. Some of it comes down to personal choice. I've been trying to get Kylie's mom involved in my channel since day one, but she just isn't interested in YouTube. She doesn't want to be a public figure. Some people just don't. So personal choice factors in heavily. But bias plays a role too, and we should try to figure out how to eliminate that bias as much as we can. I think the best way is to pick a distribution representative of the people who are actually in the field, not society more generally. Those are my biggest issues with the SJW extremist ideology. Blaming an entire group of people for something, like saying men are the root of all evil, or straight people are the problem. That's black and white thinking. That's an us versus them mentality. Expecting other people to change to suit your desires isn't logically consistent. You are responsible for your happiness. Not me, not Milo Yiannopoulos, not your mom. Nobody but you. If you don't like something that's happening, then remove yourself from the situation. Don't try to ruin, threaten, or blackmail the person speaking and anybody associated with them. And finally, I'd like to see if we could work out the cognitive biases we find. I'd like to find a way to make things a little bit more fair. But fair doesn't mean equal necessarily. Fair means fair. I don't want to get 50% female representation in anything unless 50% of the applicants are female and all other factors are considered. We can talk about ways to raise the number of female applicants, but that's an entirely separate issue. Now for anti-SJWs. You thought you were getting out of it, didn't you? No, I have an awful lot to say about this group. Like I said, I'm obviously against the SJW ideology. There's some really toxic behavior coming out of it. I would consider myself against SJWs, but I consider the anti-SJW SJW group equally as cult-like as the SJW group. Take a look at this meme. Is it true? Is this actually the case? Is feminism really harmful? What is it? Here's the dictionary definition. The advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. That doesn't seem to be inherently harmful to me, especially in places like Saudi Arabia. We need feminism in the Middle East. You want to talk about patriarchy? Islam has a stranglehold on women over there. In a lot of places, it's against the law to go outside unaccompanied by a man. A woman is worth a fraction of what a man is worth. I'm not talking wage gap. I mean, their vote is worth less. Their word is worth less in court. Is feminism really harmful? Or are you just talking about the very specific SJW ideals of feminism that extremists pick up? Because every time you say feminism is a mental disease, you're categorizing people into an outgroup, the same way SJW extremists categorize men into an outgroup. Yes, there have been lies spread by the extremists, which got traction and spread like wildfire. Like the claim that women make 70% of men, or whatever the number was. That was a misrepresentation. Taking women's median earnings and dividing by men's median earnings will give you 80% for 2017. But there are a lot of things they aren't considering in that number, like personal choice. More men apply for and want to be in STEM fields, which statistically pay a lot higher than occupations that women commonly choose. That's one of the reasons why the number is as low as 80%. Not because of bias as was being implied. Now, don't get me wrong, there are reasons why women don't typically choose STEM fields, including gender roles and things, and I'd like to fix that too. But saying women make 80% of what a man makes is a misrepresentation, plain and simple. Now, like I said, misrepresentations like that gain traction sometimes. That doesn't mean we should unequivocally categorize literally every feminist in an outgroup and say that all of feminism is harmful. Far from it. Feminism is necessary in many ways. Don't become tribalistic and name these giant movements as a mental disease. Movements which are actually needed in many places in the world. And yes, even in the US. Not anywhere near as much as it used to be, but feminism is still necessary to some extent. Let's take a look at this conversation. Somebody says a lot of apostates leave their crazy cult and embrace another, feminism. I respond, the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. What? That's a cult? This is news to me, and I'm on the cutting edge of this field. Feminism is not a cult. They say, why would you take their own definition to describe their feminist cult? Other cults do exactly the same, describe themselves as these honest people who just want to be closer to God or be moral. If you look at what they actually do, from advocacy of blatant sexism against men, eliminating parental rights of fathers, to running a scam of women's studies garbage in universities on taxpayers' dime. I responded, that was the definition I found in the dictionary. Here's my first issue with this. The person is categorizing people into an outgroup. I just found the definition in the dictionary. That's what feminism is. The things he described, sexism against men, eliminating parental rights of fathers, if that's actually what's happening, then that's extremist behavior. But I don't see feminists in Saudi Arabia doing that stuff. I don't see that happening in China. Feminism is too broad of a label to classify as a cult. There are people who call themselves feminists and engage in toxic, harmful, extremist behavior. But labeling an entire philosophy, the idea that women should have equal rights to men, is tribalistic and extremist in itself. Here's how I responded. Feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, if there's a group of people who incorporate a belief system and a structured hierarchy with a system of rewards and punishments, if they replace their members' authentic identities with a cult identity, if they discourage critical thinking and doubt, if they use loaded language and cliches, we can talk about whether or not that group is a cult. But feminism is not a cult. It's just advocating for equality on the basis of sex. And he said, by your logic, Jehovah's Witnesses are just people following God's word because they say they are. It's absurd to hide behind the dictionary when that dictionary doesn't describe feminism in the real world as it is, only as feminists want to portray it. There is a whole belief system with invisible patriarchy as an arch nemesis. It has dogma, women are always the victims and men are the oppressors. It has punishment mechanisms, social shunning, Title IX frivolous lawsuits, and mob harassment. I say it's a cult. You should research it further. It's a very dangerous cult. Here's my response. I'm not typing it out, I'm just saying it. I don't call Christianity a cult. I don't call Islam a cult. They aren't. The umbrella is too big. Christianity covers Catholicism, Methodist, Mennonite, Lutheran, Messianic Judaism, and a ton of other religions. Even Even Heaven's Gate was loosely based on Christianity. Barely, but it was. He said, "By my logic, Jehovah's Witnesses are just people following God's word because they say they are. No, by my definition, Christians are people who believe that Jesus was the Messiah and they follow his teachings. In fact, that's the standard definition of Christian. There's nothing inherently cult-like about that. I look at behavior and beliefs. Calling yourself a feminist doesn't mean you automatically adopt an ideology and a set of behaviors. It means you advocate for justice for women. Under that very specific definition, I call myself a feminist. Am I an extremist?" Here's another problem with anti-SJW ideology. There's a big problem with loaded language and cliches, which, if you remember, is on the bite model. Anti-SJWs have an almost visceral reaction when they hear terms like toxic masculinity, privilege, racist, mansplaining, body positivity, or problematic. In fact, I found a website dedicated to listing SJW terminology. But disregarding something that's said because of a word that was used in the sentence is a thought-stopping technique, and you should take a long, hard look at yourself and your feelings on a subject if you catch yourself doing it. Earlier, I used the word patriarchy. How many people had an adverse reaction to the word when I said it? You know, we actually live in a patriarchy. That's the technical, political term for the type of society we live in here in America. Saudi Arabia is also a patriarchy. Say it to yourself a few times if it doesn't sit right with you, because it's a political term that describes lots of modern-day societies. What about toxic masculinity? What is it? Honestly, this is the first time I've personally ever looked into what toxic masculinity is. But I'm sitting here reading about it because it's loaded language that I was slowly conditioned to hate. It's a term that gives me a visceral reaction when I hear it. And when I hear things like that, I want to examine them closer. Society has certain expectations of certain genders. Women are expected to be small, pretty, and sweet, and men are expected to be big, strong, and emotionless. Like how crying is socially acceptable for women, but not as much for men. Toxic masculinity is the parts of social expectations for men that are actually harmful. For example, never crying is bad for you, psychologically. You shouldn't have to bottle up your emotions. The idea that men aren't supposed to cry is toxic masculinity. It's toxic to men. There's also toxic femininity. The idea that women are supposed to be skinny leads to them developing eating disorders. That's toxic behavior that arose from societal expectations about gender. And here's my final glaring problem with anti-SJW extremism. You aren't allowed to criticize anything. Now, I understand that people have been deplatformed by extremist SJWs, and that is wrong, as I mentioned earlier. But speaking up about something you don't like isn't wrong. It should be expected. If you say something that's really messed up, really toxic, you should expect pushback. I'll give anti-SJWs the same advice I gave SJWs. If somebody says something you don't like you say the word retard and you're being criticized for it now, the onus is on you to remove yourself from that situation. It isn't on the person criticizing you to stop. People are free to criticize whomever they want, so screaming free speech a billion times isn't going to shut up the criticism. If you don't like it, then either 1, get off social media, or 2, stop throwing the word retard around all willy-nilly. That easy. Now, I know I've pissed off an awful lot of people, but we need to look at this the same way we look at anything. Up to now, I've almost exclusively spoken about religion, but I see the same tactics and extremism in politics as I do in religion. I just don't want to divide my audience on that line. I want to work together to end extremism generally. So listen to what I said here today and give it some thought. See if you can identify a few ways in which you've acted in an extremist way. I'm 100% sure I have some of this kind of behavior in some aspect of my life. It's my responsibility as a member of society to figure out how and stop it. Okay, that's all I've got for you guys. If you like the work I do, then consider supporting me on Patreon. YouTube is really volatile, and it's honestly hard to tell if my channel's even going to exist from one day to the next. So Patreon gives me the added level of stability I need to do this full time. Check out my podcast where I read extremist literature every week. I also talk about all kinds of different subjects, like games, politics, and all kinds of other stuff. All links are in the description as always. Okay, thanks for watching, guys.